You've felt it, haven't you? That weight in your chest that doesn't belong to you. That rage simmering under your skin that you never asked for. That emptiness echoing in your soul that feels ancient and foreign all at once. Here's what Carl Jung discovered that changes everything. When an empath absorbs the narcissist's darkness and actually survives it, they don't just heal. They undergo a metamorphosis so profound that the narcissist never sees it coming. The person who once soaked up every toxic projection like a sponge, they become untouchable. The soul that carried everyone else's shadow develops an immunity to manipulation that's almost supernatural. And here's the part that would terrify the narcissist if they were conscious enough to understand it. Your very presence begins forcing others to confront the darkness they've been projecting onto you all along. Let me paint you a picture. You've been carrying their rage, their shame, their soul-crushing emptiness until you couldn't even recognize your own reflection anymore. You became the emotional dumpster for their unprocessed pain while they walked away clean, pristine, leaving you alone to sort through the wreckage of their inner world like some kind of psychological janitor. But then something shifts. Not with anger, not with drama, with a quiet, almost terrifying clarity that settles into your bones. You stop explaining yourself to people who were never truly listening. You stop absorbing emotions that were never yours to carry in the first place. And most devastatingly of all for those around you, you become completely unavailable for their emotional emergencies. Jung called this process individuation, but I call it something more visceral, the birth of psychological sovereignty. The moment you reclaim your inner kingdom. What emerges from this transformation isn't some improved version of the person who walked into the narcissist's web. It's an entirely new archetype that Jung understood could fundamentally reshape every relationship in its orbit. But here's what most people completely miss about this transformation. It doesn't happen through therapy sessions or self-help books, as helpful as those can be. It happens through what Jung called the night sea journey, a descent into psychological hell so complete, so total, that it breaks you down until only your authentic self remains. Everything fake burns away in that fire. The empath who survives this journey becomes something Jung documented but rarely spoke about publicly. They become what I call a shadow walker. Someone who has stared directly into the abyss of human darkness and returned with their light not just intact, but fundamentally transformed by the experience. Jung wrote, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." The empath-narcissist dynamic is this inferno. It's a psychological crucible that either completely destroys you or transforms you into something unprecedented in your own life story. This isn't recovery. Let's be brutally honest about that. This is evolution. The kind of consciousness upgrade that Jung believed was absolutely essential for humanity's psychological development. And here's the cosmic irony that would make Jung smile. The narcissist, in their desperate, insatiable hunger to consume your soul, accidentally becomes the catalyst for your greatest transformation. They think they're destroying you. They genuinely believe they're breaking you into pieces, but they're actually forging you into something unbreakable. Jung spent decades studying what he called psychological types, and he noticed something deeply disturbing about highly sensitive individuals. They become what I call shadow containers unconsciously programmed from childhood to absorb the psychological waste that others refuse to process. Jung wrote, "The healthy man does not torture others. Generally, it is the tortured who turn into torturers." But empaths represent a third category that Jung found fascinating: the ones who absorb the torture without becoming torturers themselves. This creates what Jung termed participation mystique, an unconscious merger where the empath literally cannot distinguish between their own emotions and the absorbed projections of others. The narcissist exploits this vulnerability with ruthless precision, using the empath's sensitivity as an emotional dumping ground for everything they refuse to acknowledge about themselves. But here's where Jung's insight becomes absolutely crucial. He discovered that this exploitation, as brutal as it is, serves an evolutionary purpose in the psyche. Jung wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble, They can never be solved, but only outgrown. The empath-narcissist dynamic forces this outgrowing in the most brutal way imaginable. It's consciousness evolution through trauma, psychological development through crisis. The narcissist represents what Jung called the shadow denied, all the darkness they refuse to acknowledge about themselves. The empath becomes the repository for this denied shadow. But in carrying it, in being forced to metabolize it, they begin to understand shadow in ways that fundamentally alter their perception of reality itself. Jung believed that consciousness evolves through conflict, and the empath-narcissist dynamic is one of the most brutal consciousness accelerators known to psychology. The empath doesn't just witness this shadow material from a distance. They're forced to carry it, to live inside it, until they develop what I call shadow literacy, the ability to read psychological darkness like a native language. If you've ever felt like you were carrying someone else's emotional baggage, comment, "I was their shadow container." Jung documented what he called the dark night of the soul. But for empaths trapped in narcissistic relationships, this becomes what I call the shadow immersion experience. You don't just witness darkness, you're forced to live inside it, breathe it until it becomes your atmosphere. The narcissist projections don't just hurt, they rewrite your internal narrative at the source code level. Their shame becomes your self-doubt, their rage becomes your anxiety, their emptiness becomes your depression. You literally absorb their psychological toxins until your own identity dissolves like sugar in acid. Jung called this psychological poisoning, and he wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." But for empaths, this pain isn't just personal, it's collective. You're processing shadow material that belongs to generations of unresolved trauma, ancestral wounds that have been passed down like cursed heirlooms. The narcissist forces you into what Jung called the nigredo, the blackening phase of psychological alchemy, where everything you thought was solid dissolves into chaos. Jung wrote, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. But finding that order requires surviving the disorder first. You have to live through the dissolution." But here's what Jung discovered about this poisoning process that changes everything. The psyche has an immune system. When foreign psychological material is forcefully injected into your consciousness, your authentic self begins to develop what I call shadow antibodies, the ability to recognize manipulation at a cellular level. This is why the empath's transformation is so profound. You don't just learn about manipulation intellectually, like reading about it in a textbook. Your nervous system develops a visceral rejection response to psychological toxicity. It becomes an instinct. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." The empath who survives narcissistic abuse has made more darkness conscious than most people will encounter in an entire lifetime. You become what Jung called a wounded healer, but not in the traditional sense. You're wounded by someone else's unconscious shadow, but you heal by making that shadow conscious, by dragging it into the light. Jung observed, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed." This is exactly what happens to the empath who survives. They develop an unshakable inner peace born from having faced the absolute worst and walked through it anyway. Jung studied what he called ego death, the moment when your false sense of self collapses completely, like a house of cards in slow motion. For empaths surviving narcissistic abuse, this death is particularly brutal because their entire identity was constructed around being helpful, understanding, and emotionally available. Their whole sense of self was built on being needed. The breaking point isn't dramatic. It's quiet, terrifying in its stillness. You wake up one morning and realize you don't recognize the person staring back from the mirror. Your empathy feels dead, like a limb you can't feel anymore. Your hope feels poisoned at the root. Your ability to trust feels shattered beyond any possibility of repair. Jung wrote, The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But for the empath at rock bottom, there seems to be no self left to accept. You've absorbed so much foreign psychological material that your authentic self has been buried alive under layers of other people's unprocessed emotions. This is what Jung called the nigredo, the blackening phase of psychological alchemy, where everything that seems solid dissolves into chaos, into void. Jung observed, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." But accepting this psychological death feels impossible when you don't even know who's doing the accepting anymore. You've been so focused on everyone else's inner world for so long that you've completely lost contact with your own. But here's what Jung understood about this dissolution that changes everything. He wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." This choice only becomes possible after the false self dies completely. The old self, the people pleaser, the emotional sponge, the perpetual giver, must die before the authentic self can emerge from the ashes. And the narcissist, in their relentless attack on your identity, accidentally becomes the destroyer of your false self. They dismantle the constructed identity you built on pleasing others and avoiding conflict at all costs. This is why I call narcissists unwitting shamans. They perform a psychological dismemberment that forces individuation in ways that decades of gentle therapy might never achieve. They break you open so completely that what's real can finally emerge. Jung wrote, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." The narcissist pushes you so far into psychological nonsense that you're forced to find your own sense, your own truth, your own North Star. In this darkness, in this total dissolution, something ancient awakens. Jung called it the self, the archetype of wholeness that exists beneath all conditioning, beneath all the masks you've worn. The empath discovers they are not their trauma, not their absorbed emotions, not their compulsive giving. They are something far more powerful, something that was there all along. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But for most people, this privilege remains theoretical, something they quote on social media. They embody it at a cellular level because they've been stripped of every false identity until only truth remains. Jung was fascinated by alchemy because he saw it as a perfect metaphor for psychological transformation. The turning of lead into gold wasn't about chemistry, it was about consciousness. The empath's journey follows what Jung called the opus contra naturae, work against nature that produces something entirely new, something that didn't exist before. What emerges from this psychological crucible isn't the same empath who entered the relationship. It's what I call the integrated empath, someone who maintains their sensitivity but surrounds it with impenetrable psychological boundaries. Jung documented this transformation in his concept of the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create something entirely new from the union of opposites. The empath who survives has integrated their shadow and their light, their victim and their victor, their wound and their wisdom. They become whole by embracing all of it. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But here's the crucial difference. The narcissist remains unconscious, unchanged, while the empath becomes hyperconscious, radically transformed. This integration creates what Jung called psychological sovereignty, but what I call shadow immunity. You become literally immune to manipulation because you've developed the ability to see psychological projections before they even land on you. It's like developing night vision after being forced to live in complete darkness for years. The narcissist's tactics that once destroyed you now roll off like water off glass. Not because you've become hard or cold, but because you've become conscious. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The transformed empath has made manipulation tactics conscious, which renders them completely powerless. You can see the strings before the puppet show even begins. You recognize the script in the first act. But here's where the transformation becomes truly powerful, almost otherworldly. The integrated empath doesn't just resist manipulation. Their very presence disrupts it. Jung called this the constellation effect, when one person's consciousness level affects everyone around them like a tuning fork. Jung observed, as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. The transformed empath becomes this light, not the naive light that gets consumed and snuffed out, but the fierce light that exposes shadows wherever it shines, making them impossible to ignore. Comment if you've reached the point where manipulation attempts feel obvious and ineffective. I see through the matrix now. Jung spent years documenting archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that repeat across cultures and time, but he identified one archetype that emerges only through extreme psychological testing. What I call the shadow walker. Someone who has journeyed into psychological hell and returned with forbidden knowledge, with eyes that have seen too much. The shadow walker archetype embodies what Jung called the wounded healer, but with a crucial difference that most people miss. Traditional wounded healers heal others through their wounds, through their brokenness. Shadow walkers heal others through their wholeness, through what they've become. Jung wrote, "Everyone you meet knows something you don't know, but need to know. Learn from them." But the shadow walkers learn something most people actively avoid learning their entire lives: how to navigate the darkest aspects of human psychology without being consumed by them, without becoming them. You become living proof that psychological sovereignty is possible, that freedom exists. Your very existence threatens the unconscious contracts that keep people trapped in dysfunctional patterns. Jung observed, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. This is why your presence becomes so disruptive after transformation. You're no longer participating in the collective unconsciousness that Jung identified as the root of human suffering. You've stepped outside the matrix of projection and manipulation. Jung wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe." The shadow walker has won this struggle completely. You've developed what I call tribal immunity, the ability to maintain your individual consciousness even when surrounded by group unconsciousness, even when everyone around you is asleep. But this victory comes with a price. Jung called it the loneliness of the individuated. The price of consciousness is separation from the unconscious masses. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." Yet this loneliness isn't empty. It's full of authentic self-connection that most people never experience. You discover that being alone with your true self is infinitely preferable to being surrounded by people who only see your projections, who never really see you at all. Jung observed, "To be normal is the ultimate aim of the unsuccessful." The shadow walker has transcended the need to be normal because they've discovered something far more valuable: the ability to be real. Jung discovered that highly individuated people become what I call consciousness mirrors. Their presence forces others to see themselves clearly, often for the first time in their lives. The transformed empath becomes this type of mirror, but unlike the passive mirrors they once were reflecting back what others wanted to see, they now reflect back the truth, unfiltered. This creates what Jung called projection withdrawal. When people can no longer successfully project their shadow onto you, they're forced to confront it themselves. And this is deeply uncomfortable for unconscious people. This explains why your transformation often triggers such intense reactions from others. Some people will hate you for this mirroring effect. They'll call you cold, changed, judgmental, or even crazy. Jung understood this reaction perfectly. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But most people prefer irritation to understanding. They'd rather attack the mirror than look at their reflection. Others will be drawn to your transformation like moths to flame. They sense something different about you, a quality of presence that feels both magnetic and dangerous. Jung called this the numinous effect, when archetypal energy becomes visible in human form, when something sacred breaks through into ordinary reality. If people started treating you differently after your transformation, comment, "My energy shifted and everyone felt it." But the most profound effect happens with other empaths still trapped in narcissistic dynamics. Your very existence becomes proof that escape is possible, that transformation is real, that they don't have to remain psychological prisoners forever. Jung identified a paradox in psychological development that most people never grasp. True power comes not from controlling others, but from controlling yourself so completely that others cannot control you. The transformed empath embodies this paradox perfectly. They become incredibly powerful precisely because they no longer need power over others. They've discovered what Jung called the treasure hard to attain, complete self-possession. Jung wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." The transformed empath embodies this principle completely. Their boundaries aren't threats or ultimatums announced with fanfare. They're simply reality. They don't announce their limits. They live them. This creates what I call paradoxical magnetism. The more self-contained you become, the more others are drawn to you. The less you need their approval, the more they seek yours. The less available you are for their emotional dumping, the more they respect your boundaries. Jung wrote, "Where love reigns, there is no will to power. And where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking." The transformed empath has transcended the will to power through love, but love of self first. Self-love as the foundation, not selfishness. This self-love isn't narcissistic. It's what Jung called appropriate self-regard, the foundation of all healthy relationships. You can only give to others what you possess yourself. And the transformed empath possesses something rare in this world: unshakable self-worth that doesn't depend on external validation. Jung observed, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life." The empath who has survived narcissistic abuse has been forced into radical self-acceptance, not the comfortable kind you read about in books, the kind forged in fire. But here's where the paradox becomes truly profound. By refusing to be anyone's emotional dumping ground, you become available for authentic connection in ways you never were before. By saying no to manipulation, you create space for genuine love to enter. Jung wrote, "Even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness, and the word happy would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness." The transformed empath understands this balance viscerally. In their bones, they can hold space for others' darkness without absorbing it into their own system. They can witness without merging. You become what Jung called a container, but now you're a conscious container with clear boundaries, not an unconscious sponge soaking up everyone's psychological waste. Jung identified that some individuals are called to what he termed the guardian function, protecting others from psychological predators through their very existence. The transformed empath often embodies this guardian archetype, not through aggressive confrontation, but through impenetrable boundaries that serve as a model for others to witness. Jung wrote, "To ask the right question is already half the solution of a problem." Your boundaries become the question that forces others to examine their own psychological patterns. You become what I call a boundary beacon, living proof that psychological sovereignty is achievable. Other empaths see your transformation and begin to believe their own freedom is possible. Hope awakens in them. This guardian function operates through what Jung called morphic resonance. Your consciousness level literally lifts the consciousness of those around you, like one candle lighting another. You don't have to do anything, except be authentically yourself. Your presence alone becomes transformative. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But the transformed empath's reactions are now conscious choices rather than unconscious compulsions. You choose which chemical reactions to participate in based on what serves your highest good rather than what others need from you. This selectivity isn't cruelty, it's consciousness, it's wisdom. Jung understood that indiscriminate giving, is often unconscious addiction to being needed, rather than genuine compassion. Real compassion includes discernment. Jung observed, "Life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research." For many empaths, this research phase includes decades of unconscious absorption patterns, of giving themselves away piece by piece. The transformation represents graduation from research into conscious living. You become a guardian not through preaching or teaching, but through embodiment, through simply being what you are. Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct, acting from inner necessity." Your transformed presence creates new possibilities in others simply because you exist as proof that authentic selfhood is possible, that freedom is real. You don't need to convince anyone. Your very being becomes the argument for psychological freedom. If you recognize yourself in this transformation journey, comment, "My healing became my superpower." The empath who absorbs the narcissist's darkness and survives doesn't just heal. They evolve into an entirely new form of consciousness that Jung could only hint at in his writings, something he saw glimpses of but couldn't fully articulate. You become proof that the human psyche is more resilient than we ever imagined, that consciousness can emerge from the darkest circumstances like a lotus from mud. That authentic power comes not from controlling others, but from mastering yourself completely. The narcissists thought they were consuming your light, devouring it for themselves. Instead, they accidentally forged it into something unbreakable, something diamond hard. They thought they were destroying your empathy, killing your ability to feel. Instead, they refined it into conscious compassion that can't be exploited, that can't be weaponized against you. Your transformation becomes a beacon for other empaths still trapped in psychological prisons, showing them that freedom isn't just possible. It's inevitable once you understand the rules of the game, once you see the matrix for what it is. Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." Your journey through narcissistic abuse forced you to look inside so deeply that you discovered the indestructible core of your being. That diamond self that was there all along. That core was always there, waiting. The narcissist just cleared away everything that wasn't authentically you. They burned away the false self so completely that only truth remained. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. It was your superpower waiting to be activated through conscious integration. Thanks for walking this path of transformation with me. See you in the next level of consciousness.